Okay, with all the stuff in the news at the moment about Richard III and the dig in the car park in Leicester, I just wanted to make a short video explaining why I believe that Richard III was the rightful King of England. Now, as you may be aware, Richard is an extremely controversial figure in history, partly because of the way he has been portrayed in Shakespeare's play, Richard III. And many people probably still do hold the view that Richard was a usurper who stole the throne from his nephews, the two princes in the Tower as they've gone down in history, and that Richard had no real right to do that, and you might even believe that that's why he ultimately lost the Battle of Bosworth. There is a popular belief among some people that very few people supported Richard, and that's why he lost. And it's all down to the fact that he should never have been king in the first place. What I'd just like to talk about is why that version of history, although very, still held by quite a lot of people, doesn't really match what actually happened. Now, the whole story of how Richard got to the throne really goes back to, I'll start with 1461, which is the year that the Yorkists first came to the throne. In 1461, Richard's older brother, Edward, became King Edward IV after winning the Battle of Towton, the largest battle in the Wars of the Roses. And at that point, there were three brothers left alive in the House of York. There was Edward, who became King Edward IV, and then there was Richard, who was the younger brother, the youngest of the three brothers, who became Duke of Gloucester, title given to him by Edward. And then there was a middle brother called George, Duke of Clarence. So there were actually three Yorkist brothers in 1461, with Richard being the youngest. Now, the whole business of why Richard became king in 1483 stems from the fact that in 1464, a few years after he became king, Edward, the king, Edward IV, got married. And he got married in secret, which is suspicious, but he got married to Elizabeth Woodville in secret, and then revealed to his council months after the fact that he had actually gone through with this secret marriage. And Elizabeth Woodville became the queen and is the mother of the princes in the Tower. Now, why is that controversial? Well, it stems from the fact that many historians believe that Edward had a pattern of promising women marriage in order to get them into bed. I mean, Edward IV was a womanizer. He liked food, he liked women, and he had a pattern of doing this sort of thing. The first time that Edward tried to proposition Elizabeth Woodville, she had to basically fight him off with a knife, if you believe one of the old stories. And it's quite plausible that Edward promised to marry her, and then went through with a marriage because he was so keen to sleep with her. But what many people now believe is that Edward had done this before, and in particular had gone through a form of marriage with another lady called Eleanor Talbot. And Eleanor is the subject of this excellent book by the historian John Ashdown Hill, who is also the historian that's pioneered the DNA research that's gone on in conjunction with this recent archaeology. Well, according to Ashdown Hill's book, Eleanor the Secret Queen, Edward IV had gone through what is known as a PreContract, which is a form of marriage that takes place before then another marriage with Eleanor Talbot. Now, the rules of the game were, still are in royalty, that if children are born out of wedlock, they can't inherit the throne. And if Edward IV was in a PreContract, a form of marriage with Eleanor Talbot, and then went and married Elizabeth Woodville as well, then the second marriage cannot be valid. It cannot be a true marriage. And therefore any children are illegitimate and cannot inherit the throne. Now, whatever you may think today about the rights and wrongs of those kind of rules and the debarring of illegitimate children from the succession, whatever we, with our kind of modern attitudes may think of that, those were the rules of the game back then. As far as Clarence is concerned, the middle brother, the reason why he never gets a look in 1483 when Edward dies is that he is already dead. And this is really important as well. In 1478, King Edward had his brother George, Duke of Clarence, executed. According to what many people believe, he chose to be drowned in a barrel of wine. But he was executed in 1478. And that was because, for various reasons, he fell foul of not just King Edward, but of Elizabeth Woodville and her family, the Woodvilles. She came to the marriage with a whole bunch of hangers-on. She had a father, she had a brother, she had 2 sons by her first marriage to a Lancastrian, and all of those people were planted in influential positions. And basically George's mistake was to cross the Woodvilles. He accused Elizabeth Woodville of being a witch. He also did other things that were clearly out of control, but he crossed the Woodvilles, and ultimately Edward chose to execute his brother. And if you believe Shakespeare's play has Richard, Duke of Gloucester, sort of building up tension between the two brothers in order to pave his way to the throne. But there's absolutely no evidence of that at all. No, George was executed because he crossed Edward, and more importantly, Edward's wife's family, the Woodvilles. And it's interesting that Richard, the youngest brother, never visited the royal court again after this, and may have never seen his brother, the King Edward again. That doesn't suggest to me that Richard welcomed George's execution. It suggests to me that Richard was extremely angry about it, but couldn't say anything, had to profess loyalty to the king. He was probably scared that the Woodvilles might do the same to him. And in that context, you can understand why in 1483, when King Edward died and Richard comes to London, he intercepts the new king, Edward V, at Stony Stratford, and escorts the new king into London. You can understand why Richard was probably extremely scared and concerned about what the Woodvilles had planned for him, especially if they controlled the 12-year-old boy king. But secondly, you can understand why Richard would be extremely interested when he finds out, when he gets to London, about the PreContract, about the fact that Edward had already been in a form of marriage to another woman when he married Elizabeth Woodville, and that Elizabeth Woodville therefore was technically not Edward's wife. And the children were illegitimate and not entitled to the throne. And if the children of Edward IV weren't entitled to the throne, what about the children of the middle brother, George, Duke of Clarence? Well, they weren't entitled to the throne either, because when King Edward executed his brother, he debarred the children of George from taking the throne. And that wasn't anything to do with Richard, that was Edward's choice. So if you take away Edward's children and George's children, that leaves Richard, Duke of Gloucester. And Richard was therefore, Richard III, the rightful king. And what it boils down to is simply whether you accept that Edward's PreContract to Eleanor Talbot means that his marriage to Elizabeth Woodville isn't a valid marriage. And it doesn't matter whether we in the 21st century believe that illegitimate children should inherit the throne and so forth. The point is, those were the rules of the game back then. And so you can understand why Richard took the throne, especially if you combine the fact that he not only knows he's the rightful king, but also he believes that the Woodvilles are out to destroy him because they have a precedent for it, because they were behind persuading King Edward to commit fratricide and execute his brother George. And in that context, it is understandable that Richard chose to take the throne, not only to protect himself, but also because he believes he is the rightful king. Thanks for listening.